The clock had just struck 8:30 p.m. at Memorial Hospital when Dr. Michelle Thompson finally wrapped up her exhausting 12-hour shift. She'd spent most of the day in back-to-back surgeries, including a particularly challenging brain tumor removal that had tested even her experienced hands. Her shoulders were tense, and all she could think about was getting home to soak in a hot bath. The hospital parking lot was nearly empty as she walked to her car, her sensible heels clicking against the concrete. The night air was cool and crisp, typical for early autumn. She'd done this walk hundreds of times before, but tonight would turn out very differently from all those other nights. As she drove down the familiar streets of her neighborhood, past the neat rows of beautiful homes with their manicured lawns, she hummed along to the soft jazz playing on her car radio. This peaceful moment was shattered by the sudden flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. Dr. Thompson checked her speedometer. She hadn't been speeding. Still, she did what she'd always been taught. Turned on her interior lights, kept her hands visible on the steering wheel, and pulled over to the curb smoothly and safely. Through her side mirror, she watched as a police officer stepped out of his patrol car. Even from a distance, she could tell something was off about his body language. The way he strutted rather than walked, his hand already resting on his belt. Officer Barrett, as she would later learn his name, approached her window with an aggression that seemed out of place for a simple traffic stop. License and registration, he barked before she could even roll her window down completely. No greeting, no explanation for the stop. Dr. Thompson kept her voice steady and polite, despite the officer's hostile tone. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" The question seemed to irritate him further. "I said license and registration," he repeated, louder this time, as if she hadn't heard him the first time. "Your taillight's out." Dr. Thompson knew this wasn't true. She just had her car serviced the previous week, and she always did a walk-around check of her vehicle before leaving the hospital, a habit she developed after too many late-night shifts. But she kept this knowledge to herself for the moment, reaching slowly for her purse on the passenger seat. "I'm going to get my documents from my bag, officer," she narrated her movements clearly, something she shouldn't have to do but knew was necessary. As she pulled out her license and registration, the golden pin on her white coat caught the streetlight. The pin that marked her as the head of neurosurgery at Memorial. Officer Barrett snatched the documents from her hand, not even attempting to hide his disdain. As he shined his flashlight on her license, his expression shifted. A mix of surprise and something else, something uglier. The credentials clearly didn't match whatever assumptions he'd made when he'd first spotted her dark skin behind the wheel of a luxury car in this upscale neighborhood. "Step out of the vehicle," he demanded suddenly. "Officer, I don't understand. I've provided my documents, and I'd like to know the actual reason for this stop." Dr. Thompson's voice remained calm but firm. She was tired, she was frustrated, but most importantly, she knew her rights. "I said get out of the car." His voice had risen to a shout now, and he'd taken a step back, his hand moving to his belt again. Dr. Thompson felt her heart racing, but years of performing high-stakes surgery had taught her how to keep her exterior composed even when her insides were churning. In those few seconds, she made several quick decisions. She reached for her phone, opened her emergency contacts, and sent a quick text to her colleague who lived nearby. Then she started recording audio on her phone before placing it face down on the passenger seat. Only then did she begin to comply with the officer's demand, moving with deliberate slowness. Little did Officer Barrett know, but his next actions would not only change his life, but would become a catalyst for change in the entire police department. Dr. Thompson wasn't just any citizen he could intimidate. She was someone who understood systems, who knew how to document everything, and who had the resources and determination to stand up for herself and others who had faced similar treatment. The night was about to become much longer than either of them had anticipated, and the events that would unfold in the next few minutes would ripple through their community for months to come. As Dr. Thompson's hand reached for her door handle, she took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever might come next. She knew that what happened in the next few moments would matter, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been wrongly profiled or harassed simply because of the color of their skin. As Dr. Thompson stepped out of her car into the cool night air, the atmosphere grew even more tense. The streetlights cast long shadows across the quiet suburban street, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. She stood tall, her white doctor's coat a stark contrast against the darkness, a symbol of her profession that usually commanded respect, but tonight seemed to mean nothing to Officer Barrett. "Turn around and face your vehicle," Barrett commanded, his voice dripping with unnecessary authority. Dr. Thompson couldn't help but notice how different this was from other traffic stops she'd witnessed in this same neighborhood, where she'd seen officers chatting casually with drivers about their days. "Officer," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I'd like to understand why I'm being asked to exit my vehicle for what you claimed was a broken taillight." She maintained eye contact, had years of handling high-pressure situations in the operating room serving her well now. This seemed to irritate Officer Barrett even more. His face tightened, and he took an aggressive step forward. "You don't ask the questions here." "I do. Now turn around." Dr. Thompson could smell the coffee on his breath. He was standing so close. She thought about all her years of education, her countless hours of saving lives, and how none of that seemed to matter in this moment. But she also thought about her father's words from years ago, "Your dignity is not negotiable." "Officer Barrett," she said, noting his nameplate for the first time, "I can see your body camera is on, and I want to state clearly that I'm cooperating while also exercising my right to understand why I'm being detained. My taillight is not broken. I checked all my lights before leaving the hospital, as I always do." A car drove by slowly, its passengers clearly watching the scene unfold. Dr. Thompson noticed them pulling over a little way down the road, phones out. She felt a mix of relief and sadness, relief that they were witnesses, sadness that this was what black people had learnt to count on for safety. "You're being awfully mouthy for someone who was just pulled over," Barrett snapped, his hand resting meaningfully on his belt. "Maybe you think that fancy code means something, but out here, I'm the authority." Dr. Thompson took a slow, deep breath. She dealt with difficult personalities before, angry patients, grieving families, stressed colleagues. This was different, but she could handle it. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job. I do important work too. I've just finished a 12-hour shift saving lives at Memorial Hospital. We're both public servants. Could we please handle this professionally?" Her reasonable tone seemed to throw him off balance for a moment. He wasn't used to this, not the calm dignity, not the professional status, and certainly not being spoken to as an equal. His next words came out almost like a snarl. "Hands on the car. Now." More cars were slowing down now. Dr. Thompson's phone buzzed in her coat pocket, likely her colleague responding to her earlier text. She carefully placed her hands on her car's roof, the metal cool under her palms. She could see her reflection in the window, tired eyes, but a determined face looking back at her. "Officer Barrett," she said clearly, knowing his body camera was recording every word, "I want to state again that I'm complying with your orders while registering my objection to this treatment. I've asked repeatedly for the reason for this escalation, and you've provided none." She heard him moving behind her, the rustle of his uniform, the crackle of his radio. Then came the sound of more sirens in the distance. Dr. Thompson closed her eyes briefly, thinking of all the times she'd heard her patients talk about moments like these, moments where your heart pounds so hard you can hear it, where time seems to slow down and speed up all at once. The additional police cars were getting closer now. Dr. Thompson thought about how this scene must look to the gathering witnesses, a black woman in a doctor's coat, hands on her car, being towered over by an aggressive officer. She thought about how many times this scene had played out across the country, but usually without the protection her profession and status afforded her. Opening her eyes, she caught sight of her hospital ID badge hanging from her coat pocket. Just hours ago, she'd been in surgery, holding someone's life in her skilled hands. Now here she was, being treated like a criminal for driving her own car in her own neighborhood. The irony wasn't lost on her, but something was different about tonight. Maybe it was her exhaustion from the long shift, or maybe it was the memory of the young black teenager she treated last month, another victim of unnecessary police aggression. Whatever it was, Dr. Thompson knew this stop wasn't going to end the way Officer Barrett had planned. She wasn't going to let it become just another statistic, another untold story of power abused and dignity denied. As the backup units pulled up with their lights flashing, Dr. Thompson stood perfectly still, her mind already racing ahead to what would come next. She'd always taught her medical residents that the most important part of any situation was what you did next, how you handled the complications that arose. Now she was about to put that philosophy to the test in a very different arena. The arrival of additional police cars transformed the quiet suburban street into a scene from a movie, their red and blue lights painting everything in alternating colors. Dr. Thompson remained steady, her hands still placed on her car's roof, her mind clear despite the chaos unfolding around her. What seems to be the problem here? A new voice cut through the tension. A senior officer had arrived on the scene. Officer Cooper, as his badge revealed, approached with measured steps, taking in the unusual sight before him. A woman in a doctor's coat, perfectly still, surrounded by 3 patrol cars. Before Barrett could respond, Dr. Thompson spoke up, her voice carrying the same authority she used in the operating room. I was pulled over for allegedly having a broken taillight. Officer Barrett escalated the situation without cause and ordered me out of my vehicle. I've complied with all lawful orders while attempting to understand the reason for this treatment. Officer Barrett stepped forward, his face flushed. She's been uncooperative and... I have dash cam footage of my working taillights from the hospital parking garage exit, Dr. Thompson interrupted calmly. Recorded less than 20 minutes ago. I also have an audio recording of this entire interaction, and I can see Officer Barrett's body camera is active. Additionally, there are at least 6 witnesses filming this encounter on their phones. The small crowd that had gathered on the sidewalk continued recording. Among them, Dr. Thompson recognized Dr. Patel from the hospital's cardiology department, who lived nearby. She responded to the emergency text after all. Officer Cooper's demeanor shifted slightly as he processed the situation. He looked at Dr. Thompson's hospital ID badge, still visible on her coat, then at Officer Barrett's increasingly uncomfortable expression. "Ma'am, could you please show us these taillights?" "Of course," Dr. Thompson replied, "though I'd appreciate if Officer Barrett could maintain a professional distance. He's already displayed concerning behavior, and I fear for my safety." The statement hung in the air, professional but pointed. Officer Cooper nodded, gesturing for Barrett to step back. As they walked to the rear of the vehicle, the truth was undeniable. Both taillights were working perfectly. "Well," Officer Cooper began, but Dr. Thompson wasn't finished. "I'd like to formally report Officer Barrett's conduct," she stated, her voice clear and steady. "I believe I was profiled, harassed, and subjected to unnecessary escalation of a routine traffic stop. I'm prepared to file a detailed complaint, including the time I spent in surgery today, saving lives while wearing the same coat that apparently marks me as suspicious in my own neighborhood." A new police vehicle pulled up, this one unmarked. Dr. Thompson recognized the woman who stepped out, Lieutenant Baker, the department's internal affairs officer. One of Dr. Thompson's neighbors must have made some calls. "Doctor," Lieutenant Baker said, approaching with a notepad already in hand, "I understand there's been an incident." "Yes," Dr. Thompson replied, finally lowering her hands from the car. "And I believe it's time we had a serious discussion about why a respected neurosurgeon can't drive home from work without being harassed in her own neighborhood." The growing crowd of onlookers had fallen silent, watching as the scene transformed from a typical police stop into something else entirely, a moment of reckoning. Officer Barrett stood off to the side, his earlier bravado deflating as he realized the situation had spun far beyond his control. Dr. Thompson pulled out her phone, stopped the audio recording, and began sending it to multiple email addresses, her lawyer, her hospital administrator, and several trusted colleagues. She'd learned long ago that documentation was everything, whether in medicine or matters of justice. "I'd like to file my complaint now," she said to Lieutenant Baker, her voice carrying across the now quiet street. "But first, I want Officer Barrett's badge number and a copy of the dispatch record for this stop. I also want it noted that I'm requesting preservation of all body camera footage, dash cam recordings, and dispatch communications related to this incident." The professional precision of her requests made it clear this wasn't just another victim of police harassment. This was someone who knew exactly how to navigate the system, someone who understood how to turn an injustice into a catalyst for change. Lieutenant Baker nodded, writing rapidly in her notepad. Officer Cooper had moved to speak quietly into his radio, while Officer Barrett stood frozen, watching his routine harassment transform into what would likely become a career-defining mistake. Dr. Thompson thought about all the others who had faced similar treatment but lacked the resources or platform to fight back. She thought about her patients, her colleagues, her community. This stop had started as one man's prejudice, but she would make sure it ended as something much more significant, a documented example of the change that was possible when people stood their ground with dignity and determination. The night air had grown colder, but Dr. Thompson felt a warmth in her chest, not anger, but resolve. She knew the next few hours would be long, filled with statements and paperwork, but she was prepared. This was no longer just about her. It was about every person who had ever been pulled over for driving while black, every professional who had their credentials questioned because of their skin color, every citizen who had faced abuse of power and stayed silent out of fear. As she began giving her official statement to Lieutenant Baker, Dr. Thompson's voice remained steady and clear. The time for silence had passed. Now was the time for truth, for accountability, and for change. The next few hours unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of paperwork and procedure. The police station's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows as Dr. Thompson sat in the interview room, her white coat still crisp despite the long night. She'd been here for 3 hours now, but her voice never wavered as she recounted the events for the third time. "And you're certain about the sequence of events?" Lieutenant Baker asked, reviewing her notes. The recorder between them blinked steadily, capturing every word. "I'm a neurosurgeon," Dr. Thompson replied with a slight smile. "My entire career depends on my attention to detail and precise memory. Yes, I'm certain." Outside the interview room, the station was buzzing with unusual activity for this time of night. Word had spread quickly through the department. It wasn't every day that a prominent doctor filed a complaint of this magnitude, complete with audio recordings, witness statements, and time-stamped video evidence. Dr. Thompson's phone kept lighting up with messages of support. Her hospital colleagues had mobilized quickly, not just Dr. Patel, who'd witnessed the scene, but others who'd heard what happened. The chief of surgery had already left 3 voicemails, each one more supportive than the last. "Just one more thing," Lieutenant Baker said, sliding a form across the table. "We'll need your signature here, confirming your willingness to testify if this goes to a formal hearing." Dr. Thompson picked up the pen, her hand steady as always. As she signed, she thought about the young resident she'd mentored last year, who'd confided in her about similar experiences with law enforcement. She thought about her nephew just getting his driver's license and all the talks he'd need to have about handling police encounters. "I have some questions of my own," Dr. Thompson said, placing the pen down carefully. "I'd like to know about your department's traffic stop statistics. How many stops in my neighborhood result in vehicle searches? How many end with drivers being ordered out of their cars? And most importantly, what's the racial breakdown of these incidents?" Lieutenant Baker's expression shifted slightly. These weren't the questions she was used to getting from complainants. Most people just wanted their individual cases resolved, but Dr. Thompson was thinking bigger. That information would need to be requested through proper channels, Lieutenant Baker replied carefully. Unaware, Dr. Thompson nodded. "I've already drafted the formal request. My lawyer will be filing it first thing in the morning, along with the Freedom of Information Act request for all of Officer Barrett's previous complaints and traffic stop records." The door opened and Officer Cooper stepped in with a fresh cup of coffee for Dr. Thompson. His demeanor had shifted dramatically from the scene earlier, now all courtesy and respect. She accepted the coffee with a polite nod, but left it untouched on the table. "The hospital board chairman called," he mentioned, trying to sound casual. "He wanted to make sure you were being treated properly." "Yes," Dr. Thompson replied. "The same way every citizen should be treated during police encounters." The point wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Meanwhile, in another part of the station, Officer Barrett sat with his union representative, his arrogance from earlier completely deflated. The bodycam footage was damning, especially the part where he'd unnecessarily escalated a routine stop. His previous complaints, which had been quietly filed away, were now being pulled out and reviewed with fresh eyes. Back in the interview room, Dr. Thompson checked her watch, 2 a.m. She'd been awake for nearly 24 hours now, between her surgery shift and this ordeal. But exhaustion would have to wait. This moment was too important. "I'd like to submit an additional statement," she said, pulling a neatly folded paper from her coat pocket. She'd written it while waiting for Lieutenant Baker earlier, her doctor's handwriting perfectly legible. "This isn't just about what happened to me tonight," she began reading. "This is about establishing a clear record of what happens when law enforcement officers let their prejudices override their duty. It's about acknowledging that professional status and credentials shouldn't be necessary for a black person to be treated with basic dignity during a traffic stop." Lieutenant Baker leaned forward, listening intently as Dr. Thompson continued. "I'm in a position to fight this battle. I have resources, witnesses, and a platform. Many others don't. So while I'm filing this complaint about tonight's incident, I'm also putting this department on notice. It's time for systematic change in how officers interact with people of color in our community." The words hung in the air, heavy with purpose. Through the window, the first hints of dawn were starting to appear. Dr. Thompson had been scheduled for another surgery in 4 hours, but she'd already arranged for a colleague to cover it. Some things were more important than one day's work. As she finished reading her statement, Dr. Thompson thought about how this one traffic stop had transformed into something much larger. The next few weeks would be busy, meetings with lawyers, press inquiries, department hearings. But sitting there in that fluorescent-lit room, she knew it would be worth it. "One last thing," she said, standing up slowly. "I'd like Officer Barrett's bodycam footage downloaded and preserved immediately. All of it, including the 15 minutes before he initiated the stop. I think we'll find it very educational." Lieutenant Baker nodded, making a note. They both knew what that footage would likely show: a police officer following a black woman in a luxury car, looking for any excuse to pull her over. But now, instead of becoming another untold story of harassment, it would become evidence in what promised to be a landmark case for police accountability. The following week moved at a dizzying pace. Dr. Thompson sat in her lawyer's office, surrounded by stacks of papers and 3 computer screens displaying different angles of the incident. Her attorney, Mrs. Chen, was methodically building what she called an airtight case. "The hospital's security footage is crucial," Mrs. Chen said, pointing to one screen. "Look here, you can clearly see all your car lights working perfectly as you leave the parking garage. Time-stamped just 20 minutes before the stop." Dr. Thompson nodded, taking another sip of her now-cold coffee. She'd been splitting her time between the operating room and gathering evidence, running on determination and caffeine. The support from her colleagues had been overwhelming. Dozens had come forward with their own stories of similar encounters. "There's more," Mrs. Chen continued, pulling up another document. "We've obtained Officer Barrett's stop records for the past 3 years. The pattern is impossible to ignore. 85% of his traffic stops involved minority drivers in predominantly white neighborhoods. And look at the time of day, most occurred during shift changes at the hospital." Dr. Thompson leaned forward, her tired eyes scanning the statistics. "He was targeting medical staff," she said quietly. "People he thought wouldn't have time to file complaints because of their work schedules." The revelation sent a chill through the room. This wasn't just about one bad traffic stop, it was about years of systematic harassment. Meanwhile, across town, the police department was dealing with its own storm. The dashcam footage had leaked online, showing Officer Barrett's aggressive approach and baseless escalation. The video had gone viral, drawing national media attention and sparking renewed discussions about police reform. In the hospital break room, Dr. Thompson found unexpected allies. Nurses, technicians, and other staff members began sharing their own stories. One nurse described being followed for blocks after leaving her night shift. A radiology technician admitted he'd started taking different routes home to avoid certain patrolled areas. "But none of us said anything," the technician explained, his voice heavy with regret. "We didn't think anyone would believe us." Dr. Thompson's phone buzzed. Another email from the civil rights organization that had taken interest in her case. They wanted to use her experience as part of a larger study on discriminatory policing practices. She'd already agreed, understanding that her story could help create broader change. Back at the precinct, Internal Affairs was working overtime. Lieutenant Baker had uncovered a disturbing pattern in Officer Barrett's personnel file, multiple complaints that had been dismissed without proper investigation. Each one followed a similar pattern: minority drivers, questionable stops, aggressive behavior. Dr. Thompson, Lieutenant Baker said during their follow-up meeting, "Your case has opened a floodgate. We've received 15 new complaints about Officer Barrett since your incident. People who were too afraid to speak up before are finding their voice." The doctor nodded, thinking about her own patients who'd shared similar stories during their recovery conversations. How many times had she heard them describe the anxiety of driving home after late-night hospital visits, more afraid of being pulled over than of their medical conditions? One afternoon, while reviewing security footage with Mrs. Chen, Dr. Thompson received an unexpected call. It was from a police academy instructor who'd seen the viral video. He wanted to use her case as a teaching example in his training classes, showing future officers exactly how not to conduct traffic stops and the consequences of biased policing. "Your composure made the difference," he explained. "The way you handled yourself exposed every mistake in his approach. It's powerful teaching material." The evidence continued mounting. Hospital security had compiled weeks of footage showing Officer Barrett's patrol car routinely following staff members of color as they left work. GPS data from his police vehicle revealed extended periods of unauthorized surveillance in hospital parking areas. Dr. Thompson's lawyer organized it all meticulously: the timestamps, the witness statements, the pattern of behavior. But perhaps most damning was the audio from Officer Barrett's own body camera in the minutes before the stop, catching his muttered comments about "these people in this neighborhood." The hospital board called an emergency meeting to address the situation. Dr. Thompson presented her findings, her voice steady as she described not just her experience, but the dozens of similar stories she'd collected from hospital staff. "This isn't about one officer or one incident," she explained to the board. "This is about creating an environment where our staff can focus on saving lives without fear of harassment on their way home." The board's response was swift. They announced plans to install additional security cameras covering all hospital exits. They established a legal support fund for staff members who experienced similar discrimination, and they committed to providing testimony supporting Dr. Thompson's case. As she drove home that evening, Dr. Thompson noticed something different. Other cars were flashing their lights at her, not in warning of police, but in solidarity. The community was watching, supporting, changing. Her stand against injustice had awakened something in people, a realization that silence in the face of discrimination only allowed it to continue. The next morning's paper carried a front-page story about her case. The headline read, "Local Doctors Stand Against Police Harassment Exposes Years of Systematic Discrimination." Below it was a photo of Dr. Thompson in her white coat, standing tall outside the hospital, her expression determined but compassionate. She'd never wanted to be the face of this fight. She'd simply wanted to drive home after saving lives. But sometimes, she realized, the most important battles choose you. And when they do, you have to stand your ground, not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you. 3 weeks after the incident, the Internal Affairs investigation had grown far beyond Officer Barrett's single traffic stop. The small conference room at police headquarters was packed with boxes of files, each containing years of complaints that had previously been brushed aside. Lieutenant Baker stood at a whiteboard covered in timelines and connections, looking more like a detective solving a complex case than an internal affairs officer. "We've interviewed over 50 people," she explained to the police chief and city officials gathered for the briefing. "The pattern is unmistakable. Officer Barrett wasn't just targeting random minorities, he was specifically profiling medical professionals leaving their shifts." Dr. Thompson sat quietly in the back of the room, taking notes. She'd taken a few days off from surgery to assist with the investigation, feeling that this too was a form of healing, not for individual patients, but for the community as a whole. The evidence was overwhelming. Security cameras from local businesses had captured Barrett's patrol car following numerous hospital employees. GPS logs showed him spending hours parked near hospital exits, far from his assigned patrol area. His dashcam had recorded countless instances of him running plates on vehicles belonging to minority medical staff. "What's most concerning," Lieutenant Baker continued, pulling up a spreadsheet, "is how these complaints were handled. Over 3 years, 28 formal complaints were filed. All were dismissed with minimal investigation. The system that should have caught this behavior actually protected it." The police chief shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This wasn't just about one officer anymore. It was about a failure of oversight that had allowed harassment to continue unchecked for years. Meanwhile, at Memorial Hospital, the impact of Dr. Thompson's stand was creating ripples of change. The hospital's security office had set up a new reporting system for staff members who felt unsafe during their commutes. Stories that had once been shared in whispers over coffee were now being documented officially. Yesterday, a young resident came to my office, Dr. Thompson shared during a department meeting. She told me she'd been taking longer routes home, adding 40 minutes to her commute just to avoid certain areas where she'd been repeatedly pulled over. That ends now. The hospital administrator nodded gravely. The institution had already implemented new policies, including security escorts for staff leaving late shifts and a legal support hotline. They'd also installed additional cameras covering all hospital exits and parking areas, with direct feeds to both hospital security and police oversight committees. Back at the police station, Officer Barrett sat through another interview, his earlier arrogance replaced by growing concern. His union representative looked increasingly worried as more evidence emerged. The officer's own body camera had betrayed him, capturing numerous comments that revealed clear racial bias before and during traffic stops. "Would you care to explain this comment from March 15th? Lieutenant Baker asked, playing a recording where Barrett could be heard telling another officer that he needed to clean up certain neighborhoods by keeping them from getting too comfortable here. The investigation had also uncovered something unexpected. A network of other officers who had either enabled Barrett's behavior or participated in similar practices. Text messages between officers revealed coordinated efforts to target certain areas during hospital shift changes. Dr. Thompson's lawyer was building an even stronger case than initially expected. The hospital's security footage, combined with Barrett's own dashcam videos and body camera recordings, created a damning timeline of systematic harassment. "Look at this," Mrs. Chen said, spreading photos across her desk. They showed Barrett's patrol car following the same vehicles repeatedly, sometimes for miles, waiting for any minor infraction as an excuse for a stop. He wasn't just profiling people, he was hunting them. The media had picked up the story, but Dr. Thompson was careful about her public statements. This wasn't about becoming a celebrity or attacking the police department as a whole. It was about exposing and correcting a serious abuse of power. "I'm a doctor," she told a local reporter. "When we find a problem in medicine, we don't just treat the symptoms, we look for the root cause. That's what needs to happen here. We need to understand how this behavior went unchecked for so long and make sure it never happens again." The investigation was also revealing the human cost of Barrett's actions. A nurse had quit her job at the hospital after repeated harassment during her commute. A pharmacy technician had taken a lower-paying position closer to home to avoid late-night drives. Countless others had altered their lives in small ways, accepting discrimination as an unavoidable part of their daily routine. Each of these stories represents someone who was just trying to do their job. Dr. Thompson explained during a police commission hearing. Healthcare workers who spend their days saving lives, only to face harassment and fear on their way home. That's not just unfair, it's a public safety issue. As the investigation neared its conclusion, the evidence painted a clear picture of systematic discrimination hidden behind the excuse of routine traffic enforcement. Barrett's records showed he was more likely to search vehicles driven by minorities, more likely to issue citations rather than warnings, and more likely to escalate routine stops into confrontational situations. "The numbers don't lie," Lieutenant Baker explained, presenting her final report. Officer Barrett conducted 726 traffic stops in the past 3 years. Of those, 612 involved minority drivers. The average duration of these stops was 3 times longer than those involving white drivers, and the rate of vehicle searches was 7 times higher. The investigation had grown from a single incident into a comprehensive review of departmental practices. What Dr. Thompson had started by standing her ground during one traffic stop had evolved into a movement for genuine reform. As she left the station that evening, Dr. Thompson noticed a group of young officers watching her with what looked like respect. Perhaps that was the most important change of all, showing future officers that accountability wasn't the enemy of law enforcement, but its foundation. 6 months after that fateful traffic stop, Dr. Thompson stood at a podium in City Hall. The room was packed with community members, hospital staff, police officers, and media representatives. She smoothed her white coat, the same one she'd worn that night, and began to speak. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she said, her voice clear and steady. "But it does happen when people refuse to accept injustice as normal." The changes she was about to announce were far more comprehensive than anyone had initially imagined. Officer Barrett had been terminated from the force following a unanimous decision by the police commission, but that was just the beginning. Behind Dr. Thompson sat the police chief and hospital administrator, along with community leaders and civil rights advocates. They were there to announce a series of reforms that would transform how law enforcement operated in their city. First, Dr. Thompson continued, the department has implemented mandatory body camera reviews for all traffic stops, with quarterly audits for patterns of discriminatory behavior. No more brushing complaints under the rug. The police chief nodded solemnly. The investigation had exposed not just individual misconduct, but systematic failures in oversight. The new policies would ensure that patterns of harassment couldn't go unnoticed for years again. Second, we've established the Healthcare Workers Protection Initiative. Dr. Thompson gestured to a group of hospital staff members in the audience. This program provides legal support, safe transit options, and a direct reporting system for medical professionals who experience harassment during their commutes. The initiative had already made a difference. Reports of discriminatory stops near hospitals had dropped dramatically. More importantly, staff members felt empowered to speak up when they did encounter problems. But perhaps most significantly, Dr. Thompson said, we're announcing the creation of the Community Oversight Board. She turned to acknowledge the diverse group of citizens who would serve on the board. This independent body will review police conduct, analyze traffic stop data, and ensure that our law enforcement serves all members of our community equally. The room erupted in applause. Among those clapping was Lieutenant Baker, who had been promoted to head a new internal affairs division focused specifically on preventing discriminatory practices. After the ceremony, Dr. Thompson walked through the hospital corridors, noticing small but meaningful changes. The security desk now displayed a clear reporting procedure for staff members who felt unsafe. The parking lot had new lighting and cameras, but most importantly, there was a new confidence in the way her colleagues carried themselves. A young resident stopped her near the surgery department. "Dr. Thompson," she said quietly, "I wanted you to know, I'm not taking the long way home anymore. None of us are." That evening, Dr. Thompson drove home along the same route where she'd been stopped 6 months ago. She passed a police car and noticed something different. The officer gave her a respectful nod. It wasn't about preferential treatment, it was about establishing a new normal where respect and professionalism were the standard for everyone. At home, she opened her laptop to check the latest statistics. The new oversight system was working. Traffic stop data showed a significant decrease in racial disparities. Response times for emergency calls had actually improved now that officers weren't spending hours on unnecessary surveillance. Her phone buzzed with a message from Mrs. Chen, her lawyer. Other cities were requesting information about their reforms. The ripple effects were spreading beyond their community. Dr. Thompson thought about Officer Barrett's final hearing. He had sat there, unable to explain away years of documented bias. His termination wasn't just about punishment, it was about sending a message that the old ways of policing were over. The next morning, as she prepared for surgery, Dr. Thompson overheard 2 nurses discussing a recent traffic stop. But instead of sharing stories of harassment, they were talking about how professional and respectful the officer had been. Real change, she thought, happens in these small moments. Later that week, she visited a community center where the police department was holding a town hall meeting. Officers were there to learn from residents, not to defend old practices. The conversations were sometimes uncomfortable, but always productive. One of the new officers, fresh from the academy, approached her after the meeting. "Your case is part of our training now," he explained. "They show us the body camera footage to teach us how implicit bias can affect our judgment. It's making a difference." Dr. Thompson had started a legal fund to help others who faced similar discrimination. Already, it had assisted several cases, leading to policy changes in neighboring communities. The fund wasn't just about winning lawsuits, it was about empowering people to stand up for their rights. As she finished her rounds that evening, Dr. Thompson paused at a window overlooking the city. She thought about all the lives she'd saved in surgery over the years. But now she had helped save something else: people's dignity, their right to exist in their own communities without fear. The hospital board had recently asked her to head a new committee on community relations. They understood that healthcare wasn't just about treating physical ailments, it was about addressing the social conditions that affected their patients' lives. Sometimes, she told her medical students during rounds, the most important treatment happens outside the operating room. Sometimes healing means fixing the systems that make people sick with worry and fear. The changes weren't perfect, and there was still work to be done. But that night, as Dr. Thompson drove home under a sky full of stars, she knew that standing her ground had been worth every moment. One traffic stop had created a wave of change that would benefit generations to come. And somewhere in the city, another doctor was driving home from a late shift, no longer checking her rearview mirror every few seconds, no longer planning alternate routes to avoid certain areas. That perhaps was the greatest victory of all.